Yeah, for good reason. First off, they're just more aesthetically pleasing. You don't have those poles and wires cluttering up the landscape. And some studies suggest that underground lines can actually increase property values. But the real benefit is reliability. Because they're buried, they're much better protected from weather, trees, accidents. So fewer power outages, which is a big selling point for homeowners. And in the long run, maintenance costs can actually be lower because you don't have to worry about storm damage or tree trimming.
Sounds like there are a lot of advantages to underground lines, so why doesn't everyone just go with them?
Well, that higher upfront cost is the biggest deterrent. For transmission lines, burying them can be 4 to 14 times more expensive than overhead lines. And if something does go wrong, repairs can be way more complicated and costly. You have to dig up the line, which can disrupt service and potentially damage property.
And I imagine getting those repairs done takes a lot longer too.
It can. And making changes or expansions to the system down the line can also be tricky and expensive with underground lines. So developers really have to weigh those costs and benefits carefully. What do potential home buyers in the area want? What makes the most financial sense in the long run?
So who usually ends up paying the extra cost for those underground lines?
Typically, it's the developer who foots the bill, and then they often pass that cost on to the home buyers in the price of the homes. There has been some talk about having different utility rates for people with underground service versus overhead service to reflect the different maintenance costs, but that's still being debated.
Interesting. Okay, so now let's imagine we've got the infrastructure in place, whether it's overhead or underground. Now we have to talk about the actual electricity itself. It doesn't just flow into your house at the same high voltage, it travels over long distances, right?
No, definitely not. The electricity that travels over long distances is at a very high voltage to minimize energy loss during transmission. But that voltage is way too high for household use, so it has to be stepped down in stages.
And the first step in that process happens at those substations, right? Those big fenced-in areas you sometimes see with all the equipment.
Exactly. Substations are like the middlemen of the power grid. They take that high transmission voltage and step it down to a lower distribution voltage, which is then sent out to neighborhoods and businesses.
But that distribution voltage is still not what our appliances and lights use, right?
Right. It needs to be stepped down even further. And that's where transformers come in. Those are the things you see mounted on utility poles or sometimes in those green boxes on the ground. They take that distribution voltage and bring it down to the standard residential level.
Which in the US is usually a split phase 240 volt system, right? But I thought most things in our houses use 120 volts.
You're right, most things do. That 240 volts that comes into your house is split into two 120 volt phases in your electrical panel. So most of your lights, appliances, electronics run on 120 volts. The 240 volts is reserved for your bigger appliances like your oven, dryer, air conditioner.
Makes sense. And I still hear people talk about 110 and 220 volts. Are those just old terms for the same thing?
Pretty much. 110 and 220 are older terms, but they generally refer to the same voltage levels as the modern 120 and 240 volts. It's just a historical difference in the standard. It's also good to understand the concept of amperage, which is often rated at 100, 150, or 200 amps for a house. This basically tells you how much electrical current can safely flow into your house at any given time.
So the higher the amperage, the more electrical capacity you have for all your stuff.
Exactly. And with all the gadgets and appliances we have these days, newer houses often have 150 or 200 amp service to handle the demand.
Okay, so all this voltage transformation is crucial for both safety and making sure our appliances actually work. Speaking of safety, I imagine there are a ton of rules and regulations around how all this electrical work is done.
Oh yeah, safety is paramount, and that's why we have electrical codes. In Ohio, the Ohio Building Code adopts the National Electrical Code, or NEC, which sets the nationwide standards for electrical installations. And as of April 15th, 2024, Ohio will have its own specific residential electrical code, which incorporates elements from the NEC.
So it's like a double layer of safety, national standards, plus Ohio-specific rules.
Exactly. And those codes cover everything from the types of wire you can use to the placement of outlets and switches to the installation of safety features.
Speaking of safety features, I often hear terms like GFCI and AFCI thrown around. What do those even mean?
So GFCI stands for Ground Fault Circuit Interrupter. It's basically a super fast circuit breaker that trips if it senses an imbalance in the electrical current, which could indicate a ground fault. They're required in areas where there's a higher risk of electrical shock, like bathrooms, kitchens, garages, outdoor outlets. Ohio does have a couple of exceptions for things like garage door openers and sump pumps under certain conditions, but for the most part, those GFCI outlets are mandatory in those areas.
Makes sense. Those are places where water and electricity could potentially mix.
Right, exactly. And then you have AFCI, which stands for Arc Fault Circuit Interrupter. These are designed to detect dangerous electrical arcs, which can cause fires. They're required on most circuits that supply outlets in living areas. Ohio does have an exception for kitchen countertop receptacles, but otherwise AFCIs are pretty much standard these days.
So those are two big safety features. What are some of the other things those codes cover?
Oh, tons of stuff.
Yeah.
Like I mentioned, the type of wire you can use, the proper grounding and bonding of the electrical system, the placement of outlets to make sure they're convenient and you don't have to rely on extension cords, switch-controlled lighting in certain areas. They even dictate things like the working space around electrical equipment to make sure it's safe and accessible.
It's pretty comprehensive, and I'd imagine there are inspections to make sure all this is done correctly.
Absolutely. There are usually multiple inspections throughout the construction process. Like they'll inspect the trench before burying any underground lines, then they'll inspect the main electrical service equipment, then there's a rough inspection after the wiring's done but before the walls are closed up, and finally a final inspection once everything's in place.
So it's a multi-step process to ensure everything is up to code and safe for the homeowners.
Exactly. And it's the developer's responsibility to make sure their contractors are following all the codes to avoid any issues or delays.
Okay, so the houses are built, the power is on, people are moving in. Does the utility company just step back at that point?
Nope, not at all. The responsibility for maintaining the electrical infrastructure is actually shared between the utility company and the homeowner.
So how does that breakdown work?
Generally, AES Ohio is responsible for maintaining everything up to the electric meter, including their power lines, whether they're overhead or underground. You might even need to come onto a homeowner's property sometimes to replace those high voltage underground lines. And remember that call before you dig rule. AES Ohio has to follow those same procedures before doing any excavation work on their lines. And for overhead lines, they have a regular tree trimming program to prevent those branches from interfering with the lines.
So if a tree falls on a power line, that's AES Ohio's problem to deal with.
Exactly. The homeowner is responsible for the service line, which is the wiring from the pole or the underground connection point to the house. They're also responsible for everything after the meter, including the meter box, the service entrance cable, all the wiring and outlets and fixtures inside the house, and of course, their own appliances.
So basically, AES Ohio takes care of the main lines, and the homeowner takes care of everything on their property.
Yep, pretty much. And if there's a power outage, AES Ohio is who you call. They'll diagnose the problem and get the power back on. Homeowners should also know that AES Ohio has the right to access their property for meter reading and any necessary maintenance or repairs on their equipment.
So it's good for homeowners to understand those shared responsibilities and who to contact if they have any issues.
Definitely.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, from rezoning farmland and dealing with environmental assessments to working with the power company, understanding those overhead versus underground lines, all the voltage transformations, the electrical codes and inspections, and finally, the ongoing maintenance. It's quite a journey to get electricity to those new homes.
It is, and something a lot of us probably take for granted until something goes wrong.
Absolutely. And for our listeners who love to get that deep understanding of how things work, we hope this deep dive has been enlightening. It really highlights how much goes on behind the scenes to build a community from the ground up, literally from the ground up.
And it's interesting to think back on some of the things we discussed. The fact that a zoning change can sometimes go to a public vote, the incredible level of detail involved in those environmental assessments, the huge cost difference between overhead and underground lines, those multi-stage voltage transformations, and all those very specific safety codes. It's all pretty fascinating when you really dig into it.
Definitely makes you appreciate all the effort that goes into making sure we have reliable electricity. So for listeners, as we wrap up, here's something to ponder. Given all the complexities and trade-offs we've talked about, what do you think is the most important factor when planning and powering a new residential community? Is it keeping costs down, ensuring reliable service, minimizing environmental impact? Or is there something else that you prioritize? It's something to think about next time you see a new development going up in your area.
It is. There's a lot to consider.
And As always, we've just scratched the surface here. If you're interested in learning more, you can always dive into your local zoning ordinances, check out Ohio's environmental regulations, or even look at the detailed guidelines that AES Ohio provides for developers. There's a wealth of information out there if you want to explore further.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks for joining us for this edition of The Deep Dive.
Thanks for having me.
We'll catch you next time.